Chapter 13. Intelligent Design and Information Theory. Intelligent design became an informal movement about 25 years ago. In 1990, the lawyer and Darwin skeptic Norman Macbeth unexpectedly received in the mail a manuscript from the UC Berkeley law professor Philip E. Johnson. He questioned Darwinism in much the same way that Macbeth had in his book, Darwin Retried. Not long after that, Johnson's manuscript was published as Darwin on Trial, 1991. It's convenient to think of the intelligent design, ID movement, as beginning with that book. Some of ID's leading researchers soon joined Philip Johnson and gave him their full support. Here are 7 in alphabetical order: Michael Behe, William Dembski, David Klinghoffer, Stephen Meyer, Paul A. Nelson, Richard Sternberg, and Jonathan Wells. Today, many more names could be added. Discovery Institute also opened its doors in 1991. Others say that claims about intelligent design began earlier, in the 1980s. The atheist astronomer Fred Hoyle used the term in 1982, and in 1984, 3 scientists, Charles Thaxton, Walter Bradley, and Roger Olson, published The Mystery of Life's Origin. They argued for an intelligent cause behind the origin of the information in DNA. In 1861, Charles Darwin referred to intelligent design, but in a way that Richard Dawkins surely would have liked and admired. Here's Darwin. One cannot look at this universe with all living productions and man without believing that all has been intelligently designed. Yet when I look to each individual organism, I can see no evidence of this. And here's Dawkins. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. In The Origin of Species, Darwin did not address the problem of how life began, beyond saying that it was breathed into some primordial form. Later, in an 1871 letter to his friend J.D. Hooker, he said that life may have begun in a warm little pond. Darwin's allies have basically accepted that because they don't have anything better to offer. To this day, the origin of life remains a mystery. No one has been able to create life, whether in a warm little pond or in a test tube. But not for lack of trying. Nida Sahai, a professor at the University of Akron and an origin of life researcher, listed some of the types of molecules that would have to be coordinated to form life, including, as she put it, 4 nucleotides, 20 amino acids, a few lipids, several clays, and other minerals. In a 2014 lecture entitled The Origins of Life, From Geochemistry to Biochemistry, she called the task of getting just the right components to form life in a lab a combinatorial nightmare. Then she said, "We need to use not intelligent design." Oops, she almost invoked the forbidden theory. She was quickly rescued by another professor who told her to say, "careful selection." So she changed the wording. We need to carefully select which nucleotides to start with, which amino acids and minerals. As this intervention suggests, intelligent design has become unmentionable in biology departments, except as something to deny, disdain, or attack. I shall say more about biologists' hostility to the very idea of intelligent design later in this chapter. Meanwhile, it is more than reasonable to maintain that the origin of life did indeed require intelligent design. No one yet has been able to explain that origin without design. When Ben Stein asked Richard Dawkins in the movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, how life began, Dawkins said that he had no idea, and neither did anyone else. Late in the day. One might say that, for those who dispute Darwinism, intelligent design theory came along late in the day. One explanation is that an effective critique of Darwinism can be mounted without relying on intelligent design, just as Macbeth did in Darwin Retried. Furthermore, ID, in its recent incarnation, has largely depended on the discovery of DNA and its details in the 1950s and 1960s. Nonetheless, intelligent design adds considerably to the case against neo-Darwinism. It confronts the theory with huge improbabilities that Darwin himself could not have foreseen. Random DNA change is the only mechanism at the Darwinists' disposal, so they must either abandon their creed or accept that highly improbable events routinely occur within the cell. Recall that Darwin and his contemporaries had no way of knowing just how complex a cell is. Today, it is sometimes compared to a high-tech factory. But a cell is far more complex than that. For one thing, factories can't replicate themselves. Meanwhile, we are repeatedly told that ID can't be right because Darwinian evolution is a fact. But we can search in vain for facts that establish the truth of the theory. Natural selection? It cannot create new species. Instead, it works in the Darwinian mind as a magic wand that makes problems disappear as easily as a magician's props. Further, natural selection is not available as a mechanism until the first replicating cell has appeared. Common descent is a deduction from Darwin's theory, but it has never been demonstrated. Homology is a fact of nature, but it is also common in human design. Organisms are observed to vary about a mean, but never to depart indefinitely from the original type. And so it goes. But one philosophy has attached itself like a limpet to Darwinism. That is the philosophy of materialism or naturalism. And it does seem to support the theory. But it turns out that philosophical materialism severely restricts the possibilities of science. In fact, science was long promoted by Christians without any reliance on materialism. In The Genesis of Science, 2011, James Hannam elaborates on his thesis that the Christian Middle Ages launched the scientific revolution. Later, Isaac Newton, a theist, saw that design was necessary in explaining the origin of the solar system's planetary orbits. ID as an inference. Intelligent design is not a deduction from a philosophy, but an inference from observed facts. In everyday life, we make inferences to design all the time. The philosopher William Lane Craig put it this way: a beachcomber who comes upon a sandcastle recognizes that it's not the result of the action of the waves and the wind, but of intelligent design. An archaeologist excavating a site can tell the difference between a human artifact, such as a statue, and an object misshaped due to erosion. Sometimes it can be difficult to make that distinction, as with an early hand axe. But the occasional difficulty does not render the distinction itself invalid. Inferences to design are often made long after the designer has departed from the scene, or whose identity may never be known. Anyone who tried to argue that the image of 4 U.S. presidents on Mount Rushmore was a product of wind erosion would be judged insane. We know that they were designed, and we know that without necessarily knowing the name of the designer, the number of his assistants, or when or how the carving was done. Stonehenge? We know it was designed thousands of years ago, although we don't know by whom. As for its purpose, that is still uncertain and debated. We have no problem then in inferring human design. After all, humans design things every day. But an inference to design in nature, and biology in particular, is contrary to the unwritten rules of contemporary science. Allowing that organisms are designed would take us into forbidden territory. That reminds us of the materialist philosophy that currently presides over science, even though its role is often inexplicit. In a purely materialistic universe, design is impossible. In such a world, all we have are colliding atoms and molecules. Matter, on a materialistic theory, creates mind. Philip Johnson once allowed that evolution is the most plausible explanation for life if you are using naturalistic terms or materialistic philosophy. Why should our everyday judgments about design be suspended in the case of living organisms? Because admitting design in biology would immediately overthrow Darwin's theory. Its whole thrust from the beginning was to eliminate the need for a designer, to persuade us that nature could construct organisms without any input from a designer. That is precisely what natural selection was supposed to have achieved. But of course it didn't. In order to find out what or who its designer is, said Thomas Woodward, a historian of intelligent design, one must go outside the narrow discipline of biology. Irreducible complexity. In Darwin's Black Box, 1996, Lehigh University's Michael Behe drew attention to the irreducible complexity of the bacterial flagellum, a molecular machine that drives bacteria through fluids. The removal of a single segment of the flagellum immobilizes the whole thing. Behe's description of irreducible complexity was a key moment in the development, or should I say the evolution, of the ID movement. Much has been made of the flagellum because of Behe's expert knowledge of the topic, but many other body parts have diverse components and are also irreducibly complex. Darwinism requires that bodies be built one small step at a time. But Behe argued that the flagellum could not have been constructed that way. He used a mousetrap to explain why not. It will not catch any mice until all its parts are connected correctly. A solitary spring that is part of a mousetrap will not catch a single mouse. Analogously, the bacterial flagellum will not work until all of its parts are properly in place. Part of a flagellum will not propel a bacterium slowly. It won't propel it at all. But Darwin's theory obliges us to accept that complex structures are assembled piecemeal, each piece conferring an advantage over its predecessor. In the Darwinian scheme, the organism also must be capable of surviving at each incremental stage. It's as though General Motors was obliged to construct automobiles in such a way that they could be driven both before and after each major component was added on an assembly line. Loyal Darwinians, such as Kenneth Miller of Brown University, have tried to hold the line. By the logic of irreducible complexity, he wrote, the component parts of the flagellum should have no function until all those parts are put into place, which is not what Behe claimed. Miller pointed to one part in particular, the type 3 secretory system, which exists both inside the flagellum and separately outside it. Therefore, it didn't depend on the flagellum to work. In his response, Behe pointed out that Miller wasn't thinking clearly. To simplify, a number of functioning parts have to be inside a box if it is to work. Miller then found a part inside the box that also existed outside the box. In his criticism, Behe compared the secretory system to a pump. Suppose I said that a car was irreducibly complex because it needed wheels, a motor, and chassis. Later, it was discovered that a car also has a fuel pump. Miller's position is like saying the car is not irreducibly complex because the fuel pump can exist outside the car and work as a standalone pump. But that doesn't say how a functioning car can be put together without a fuel pump. The car still requires all those parts. Miller's argument doesn't even say where the fuel pump came from. In short, the flagellum resists the standard Darwin variety explanation. As it cannot function with a part missing, it is reasonable to infer that it was assembled all at once, and that implies design. Notice, this is not the same as claiming that God created the flagellum or any other part. Such a conclusion is derived from a theistic premise, where the designer is posited at the outset. Intelligent design theory, then, does not identify a designer, any more than we can identify the designer of Stonehenge. Complex specified information. It is unexceptionable that intelligent causes can do things which unintelligent causes cannot, said the mathematician and philosopher William Dembski, at the time a senior fellow at Discovery Institute. In 1996, he published his explanatory filter, yielding an inference to design. The explanatory filter proceeds by eliminating events or structures that cannot be regarded as designed, because they are products either of chance or necessity. It's true that necessary or law-like events are not designed. Consider a stone that is washed off a cliff. Its landing place can be predicted, and its path described mathematically. But its landing place cannot be considered to be intelligently designed. It is law-like, a product of gravity and Newton's laws of motion. Some might say that the law of gravity was itself designed by the creator of the universe, but that introduces an unnecessary complication that can, for our purpose here, be ignored. Next in the filter, we turn to chance. Chance events are obviously not designed. A randomly chosen sequence of, say, 20 or more letters of the alphabet is highly complex and improbable. It would take a very long time to reproduce it by a random method, by throwing down Scrabble pieces, for example. But the problem here is that any sequence of 20 letters is as improbable as any other. Improbability alone does not entail design. Every bridge hand ever dealt is improbable, and it would take a dealer a long time to replicate a given hand. But it is erroneous to see something as designed merely because reproducing it by random means would be time-consuming. A random sequence of 20 or so letters, or numbers, does contain a high level of information, but that refers to information as measured by the MIT theorist Claude Shannon. The problem is that Shannon's theory cannot distinguish functional or message-bearing sequences from random or useless ones, as Stephen Myers said in Signature in the Cell. Message-bearing does not appear until a particular sequence is specified. What does that mean? Consider a well-known sequence of letters. In the beginning was the Word. That series of letters and spaces is neither a product of law nor random. It corresponds to a sentence found independently of any procedure for randomly aligning letters. So it is specified. It is also complex. It would take a long time to reach that sequence from St. John's Gospel by throwing down letters randomly. So it is both complex and specified. From that, we can infer that it was designed. Generalizing from this, William Dembski formulated the law of small probability. Specified events of small probability do not occur by chance. Going from the sublime to the mundane, an argument reminiscent of Dembski's was made by Ian Fleming in his James Bond book Goldfinger. At one point, the villain said, "Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action." Goldfinger understood that someone, James Bond, was targeting him. His inference to enemy action was also an inference to design. Intelligent design in the body. Complex specified information is what is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement or sequence of things. In biology, it can be thought of as analogous to software code, instructions for a new computer program. DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created, Bill Gates once said. In the same way, DNA contains a set of instructions used in the assembly of proteins. Darwin's geologist friend Charles Lyell said that in trying to understand events in the remote past, we should look for causes now in operation. Mind satisfies that requirement. In fact, mind is the only known cause of the kind of sequence-specific code that we see in biology. Improbabilities, questionable in bridge hands, really do arise when sequences are specified. Along the DNA molecule, we find a long string of nucleotides, signified by the four letters A, C, G, and T. Their sequence along the DNA backbone at first may seem to be random, just as the sequence of letters in an English sentence might appear random to someone who knows nothing about the English language. But we now know that nucleotides form sequences that the genetic code uses to construct proteins. Proteins, in turn, are highly specified, complex structures found all over the animal kingdom. Nucleotides convey information by virtue of their sequence, not their chemical properties. In other words, the desired sequence is specific. DNA is like written language in that respect. Both SALT and LAST contain the same four letters, but convey different meanings based on their sequence alone. The sequence hypothesis was first proposed in 1958 by Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. The hypothesis states that the sequence of bases in the genetic material determines the sequence of amino acids for which that segment of DNA codes. Crick also thought that the amino acid sequence in turn determines the three-dimensional structure into which proteins fold. How rare are the functional sequences among those that are possible in an amino acid chain of a given length? Even by 1966, 8 years after Crick's proposal, not enough was known about molecular biology to answer that question. But a postdoctoral researcher at Cambridge named Douglas Axe was able to find some answers. If we are talking about sequences of 150 amino acids capable of folding into function-ready structures compared to all possible sequences of that length, Axe determined the ratio to be 1 to 10 to the 74th power. Axe told Steve Meyer that the odds of finding a functional protein by random mutation are far lower than the odds of finding a given atom out of all the atoms in our galaxy. The underlying problem is that the 20 relevant amino acids can be assembled in trillions of ways. Yet the vast majority of those sequences will not cause proteins to fold correctly, and proteins which do not fold correctly will not function. Many necessary proteins in cells require numerous amino acids linked in sequence. Most genes, sections of DNA that code for a specific protein, consist of at least 1,000 nucleotide bases, Meyer wrote. That corresponds to 4 to the 1,000th power possible base sequences of that length, an unimaginably large number. Further, proteins typically require hundreds of amino acids in order to perform their functions. Participants at the Y-Star Institute conference in Philadelphia saw this as a problem as long ago as 1966. They understood the immensity of the combinatorial space associated with proteins of merely average length. They realized, Meyer continued, that if the mutations themselves were truly random, that is, if they were neither directed by an intelligence nor influenced by the functional needs of the organism, as neo-Darwinism stipulates, then the probability of the mutation and selection mechanism ever producing a new gene or protein could well be vanishingly small. Discovery Institute's Jonathan Wells points out that the improbability problem is not confined to the first cell. New protein folds would have to originate throughout the history of life, not just with the first cell, said Wells. Even in the early history of bacteria, many new proteins would have been needed. Yet the origin of even one functional protein by a Darwinian mechanism is so unlikely that the odds are effectively zero. So the question is, if chance is the only permissible agent of change, how did the specified sequences appear in the DNA in the first place? The answer is that the cell, and along with it the DNA molecule, must have been intelligently designed. No known undirected chemical process can produce the information necessary to account for the origin of the first living cell or any later cell or system. A professor of microbiology at the University of Chicago, James Shapiro, wrote in 1996 that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. Just as computer code comes from programmers, so functional information in the cell comes from intelligence. It comes from mind, not from matter. Entrenched hostility to ID. In preferring intelligent to mechanistic cause, intelligent design theory is in direct competition with the dominant evolutionary theory of biological origins, neo-Darwinism. So it has faced much opposition. A good example is found in Wikipedia's lengthy article on ID. It begins, "Intelligent design, ID, is the pseudo-scientific view that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection." Numerous attempts have been made to change such derogatory comments, but all such changes are promptly reversed on Wikipedia, sometimes within minutes. Leonard Krishtaka, a biologist and director of the University of Kansas Museum of Natural History, has said that design can't be measured. Therefore, it is a religious belief and science has no comment on that. He might have added that complex specified information can be measured and has been found to be wildly improbable absent design. He might also have said that macroevolution has not yet been measured or so much as observed. The pretense that it has depends on extrapolation, from which valid scientific conclusions can be drawn only tentatively and with numerous caveats. In 2005, on the front page of the Washington Post, Barry Lynn, the director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, said that intelligent design is merely a veneer over a certain theological message, thus falsely identifying ID with religion. When he was at Baylor University, Dembski formed the Polanyi Institute to debate these issues, with Darwinians and ID opponents included on the board. But the institute was shut down after vehement protests from Baylor's biology faculty. They did not want ID to be so much as discussed. Darwinians today are eager to stick their own labels onto ID. Intelligent design creationism is one favorite. It's as though an unseen collective voice had cried out, "Give us back our preferred enemy, bring back creationism." That we knew how to respond to. But so far, no intelligent rebuttal of intelligent design has appeared. A privileged planet. Intelligent design also arose as a contentious issue after publication of The Privileged Planet: How Our Place in the Cosmos is Designed for Discovery. The book, by Guillermo Gonzalez and J.W. Richards, Regnery Books, 2004, challenged the Copernican principle, the idea that there is nothing special about Earth or its place in the universe. The authors replaced the Copernican principle with the anthropic principle. The claim that had the physical parameters of the universe been slightly different, we wouldn't be here to observe it. The implication is that intelligent life requires the existence of a cosmos of quite a specific level of complexity, said Steve Fuller. And that level of complexity borders on the miraculous, unless, of course, it was somehow purpose-made. A faculty member at the University of Warwick, Steve Fuller was appointed to a chair in social epistemology in 2011. The presence of essential elements on Earth, particularly carbon, oxygen, and water in the right proportions, led to the claim by Gonzalez and Richards that the planet was designed for multicellular organic life. One reviewer of the book pointed out that bringing together the conditions for life as we know it is so complex that advanced life may be exceedingly rare. Extraterrestrial life remains elusive despite a great deal of searching, so the idea that ours is a privileged planet still has not been refuted. Gonzalez and Richards went further and said that the universe itself, not just our place in it, was designed for discovery. They maintain, for example, that Earth and the Moon work together to sustain earthly life as one intricate system, producing the best solar eclipses available to earthly observers. They also claimed that Jupiter and Saturn protect Earth from cataclysmic destruction. What happened next was perhaps more interesting than the claims in the book. Gonzalez, an assistant research professor of astronomy at Iowa State University, and the author of over 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, including articles in Nature and Science and a Scientific American cover story, was refused tenure in 2007. The problem was that he had invoked intelligent design. This was too much for faculty members, and not just at Iowa State University. Over 400 professors across the state signed various statements opposing all attempts to represent intelligent design as a scientific endeavor. Both on and outside the planet, whether in astronomy or biology, the professors insisted, the philosophy of naturalism is expected to enjoy a monopoly. Any alternative claim was rejected as unscientific. William H. Jeffries, a professor of astronomy at the University of Texas at Austin, spoke for many in the academy. He said in a review of The Privileged Planet that what is new in this book isn't interesting, and what is old is just old hat creationism in a new modern-looking astronomical costume. In 2013, Guillermo Gonzalez joined the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Ball State University in Indiana. He told members of the department that he would continue his research on astrobiology and stellar astrophysics. I will not be discussing intelligent design, ID, in my classes. I didn't discuss ID at Iowa State University either. He reiterated his view that evidence of design in cosmology is not out of the mainstream, and a number of cosmologists and physicists hold to this view. He also said that he was denied tenure at Iowa State not because of poor academics on my part, but for ideological and political reasons.